All right, Esther chapter 8 is where we are. And when you read through the story of Esther for the first time, it's possible that as you're reading through, you get to the end of chapter 7 and you would go, this kind of feels like the end of the story. Because here's the way it breaks down. Chapters 1 and 2 are the prologue to the book of Esther. They're where we learn the backstory. We learn about how Queen Vashti was banished because she displeased her husband, the king. And then you jump ahead 5 years and we learn that Esther, a young Jewish girl whose name was Hadassah, she becomes the new queen, the replacement for Queen Vashti. And she pleases the king, becomes his new queen. That's all the prologue, which gets you into chapter 3. And chapters 3 through 7 in Esther are the main heart of the story. So what's going on in chapters 3 through 7? We learn about a plot that is unveiled by the king's chief of staff, a guy named Haman. And Haman wants to kill all of the Jews in the Persian Empire. And the reason he wants to kill them all is because he's mad at Mordecai. Mordecai is Esther's cousin who has been raising her since she was a child. And when Haman was appointed chief of staff, the king said, everybody bow when you see Haman, just like you would bow for me. And Mordecai said, I'm not going to do that. And that ticked off Haman. And so he said, I'm going to show you, I'm going to have you put to death and all your people put to death. And he got the king to issue an edict that said everybody who's a Jew will die on a particular day. You can kill them and you can loot their property, and they're enemies of the state. And that edict went out all through the Persian Empire. And of course, Mordecai becomes aware of this. He mourns that. He goes to his cousin Esther, who's the queen, and he says, we got to do something to get the king to stop this. She says, if I go to see the king, I might be put to death. But then she says, but this is what I got to do, and if I perish, I perish. She goes to the king. She puts together a strategy, a plan, has a series of banquets, 2 banquets, where in that course of that she unveils the plot. She exposes the plot against the Jewish people. The king is incensed that his chief of staff would have done something like this, and he decides that his chief of staff should be put to death. And when you get to the end of chapter 7, what you find is Haman, the wicked, evil person who had put together the whole plot against the Jews, is impaled on his own gallows that he had created to try to kill Mordecai. And you get to the end and it says, Mordecai was put to death. This is the end of chapter 7. Mordecai is put to death and the king's anger is assuaged. It's appeased. And you kind of get there and it's kind of like, well, that's the end of the story. The evil person has been done away with. But there's something else that's still happening, one small detail, and that is this edict about the Jews being killed. It's still out there and still in force. So while Haman has been dealt with, and while the kings turned away from listening to Haman, we still have an edict to deal with, and that's what brings us to chapter 8 as we come into the last part of this story. So we're going to read chapter 8 together. Before we do that, let me pray for our time in God's Word. Father, your word is precious to us. We love you. We love your word. We love the revelation of yourself in your word. And we pray that as we come now to your word, you would give us soft, open hearts to hear what your Spirit would say to us through your word. Open our eyes, give us eyes to see and hearts to obey. We ask in your name. Amen. You follow along as I read. This is Esther chapter 8, and we begin at verse 1. It says, on that day, and that day is the day that Haman was put to death, on that day, King Ahasuerus, who is also King Xerxes, on that day, King Ahasuerus gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was to her. And the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. Then Esther spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet and wept and pleaded with him to avert the evil plan of Haman the Agagite and the plot that he had devised against the Jews. When the king held out the golden scepter to Esther, Esther rose and stood before the king, and she said, if it please the king, and if I've found favor in his sight, and if the thing seems right before the king, and if I'm pleasing in his eyes, let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who are in all the provinces of the king. For how can I bear to see the calamity that is coming to my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred? Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, Behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and have hanged him in the gallows, because he intended to lay hands on the Jews. But you may write as you please with regard to the Jews in the name of the king, seal it with the king's ring, for an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked. The king's scribes were summoned at that time, in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day, and an edict was written according to all that Mordecai commanded concerning the Jews, to the satraps and the governors and the officials of the provinces, from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces, to each province in its own script, and to each people in its own language, and also to the Jews in their script and in their language. And when he wrote the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed it with the king's signet ring, then he sent the letters by mounted courier, riding on swift horses that were used in the king's service, bred from the royal stud, saying that the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, children and women included, and to plunder their goods. On one day throughout the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. A copy of what was written was to be issued as a decree in every province, being publicly displayed to all people, and the Jews were to be ready on that day to take vengeance on their enemies. So the couriers mounted on their swift horses that were used in the king's service. They rode out hurriedly, urged by the king's command, and the decree was issued in Susa the citadel. Then Mordecai went out in the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white, with a great golden crown and a robe of fine linen and purple, and the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor, and in every province and in every city, wherever the king's command and his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. Many from the people of the country declared themselves Jews, for fear of the Jews had fallen on them. Amen. May God add his blessing to this reading of his word. Okay, so here's the situation. Haman is dead, and it's a new day in Persia. And lots of things are new. In fact, Esther has newfound wealth. She's been given the house of Haman. Mordecai has a new job. He now has the signet ring that belonged to Haman. Esther has a new request for the king. And Xerxes, King Ahasuerus, authorizes a new edict. Mordecai drafts and sends out this new edict, and there is new hope and new rejoicing in Persia as a result. That's the outline of this chapter. Chapter begins with the king's announcement that the estate of Haman now belongs to Queen Esther. We don't know how probate worked in ancient Persia. We don't know if Haman had a will, but what we know is that if you were the enemy of the king and you were publicly executed, the king took whatever belonged to you. So the king takes everything that belonged to Haman, which would have been considerable. He's the second most powerful person in Persia, and he says, "Here, my dear," to his queen, "this now all belongs to you. Houses and land and servants and property and money, it all belongs to you." So her net worth has just increased substantially. Of course, the irony here is that when Haman issued the edict to kill the Jews, what he told the king was, when we kill them, we will plunder all of their possessions and we'll fill the royal treasury with the plunder. Well, the irony is now Haman has been plundered. He's been put to death, and all of his property now comes into the royal treasury. It's just in the wife's bank account, okay? So the royal family is now wealthier because of the death of Haman. And for the first time in this story, King Xerxes learns that Mordecai the Jew, who he's known for a long time, is his wife's cousin. They've been keeping all of this secret all the way through the story. Remember, it's not been until this week, when all of this happened, that the king learned that his wife's a Jew. She has just disclosed that to him, and she She may have known that there was some connection between Esther and Mordecai, but she didn't know they were relatives. So this is all news. In the past 24 hours, he's been reminded, he's learned that his wife's a Jew, he's learned that Mordecai is her cousin, and he's been reminded of the fact that Mordecai, 5 years ago, uncovered an assassination plot and saved the king's life. So all of this happening in 24 hours, and the king, in response to this, takes the signet ring, which had been worn by Mordecai, which is kind of that ring you flash that gets you in anywhere, right? It says, I'm the number 2 guy for the king, or I have the king's authority. And the signet ring has an inscription on it, and when you use the inscription and you go into the wax, the hot wax with that, it seals it and says whatever you do that with comes with the king's authority. So to get the signet ring that had been on Haman's hand and now give it to Mordecai, this is pretty significant. He does not make Mordecai his number 2. In fact, Esther says, I'm going to put you in charge over all of this Haman stuff that we just got in the family. So the property and the slaves, you're in charge of the house of Haman. But he does have the king's authority to enact business using the signet ring. And again, here's the irony that's going on here. All of this happened because Haman couldn't deal with the fact that Mordecai wouldn't bow down before him. Now, Mordecai's in charge and Haman's dead. The reversal has taken place. So, a week ago, Mordecai was wearing sackcloth and ashes. A week ago, he was wailing in the streets. A week ago, he wasn't welcome in the palace because he was in mourning. And his people were facing genocide. Esther was still keeping her identity a secret. She didn't even know about the genocide. And now, a week later, look at the reversal that's taken place. Everything has changed except for one thing. The genocide is still coming. That edict is still in force. Now, you might think, I might think, that at this point in the story, things have turned around enough for Esther and Mordecai that they might look at each other and go, you know what, let's just pull back and we'll regroup and we'll figure out what to do with this edict later. But right now, let's go check out our new house. Let's go check out the new possessions we have. I mean, their fortunes have been reversed in a significant way. You might think that they might put off dealing with the edict for a later time, but they don't. Verse 3 says that Esther was so grieved by the thought that the edict was still in force that she went to the king. She falls at his feet. She pleads with him, begging him to do something about the edict. In verse 6, she says, how can I bear to see the calamity that is coming to my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred? I've thought a lot about that verse this week as I've been thinking about this part of the story. I had a friend of mine who was in town this week, a couple that I've known for a couple of decades. Dave and Ann Wilson are from Detroit, Michigan. Dave's a pastor of a large church in the Detroit area, and he and Ann speak together at our Weekend to Remember Marriage getaways around the country. In fact, they're in Chattanooga this weekend speaking at a getaway. And they came here this past week because they have a new book on marriage coming out, and we recorded some radio programs about their new book. Dave helped plant the church that he's a part of in Michigan, helped plant it 27 years ago. And I asked him about the planting of the church, and he said, you know, here's what was on my heart. He said, I wanted a church where guys who didn't like church would feel comfortable coming to church. Because that's Dave's heart. Dave played quarterback at Ball State. Actually, Dave played high school football in, I think it was in Findlay, Ohio, and he was a star quarterback in Findlay, Ohio before he went to Ball State, and he set all of the records at his high school in Findlay, Ohio, until the next star quarterback came along who broke all of Dave's records. His name is Ben Roethlisberger, and so he kind of became a big deal. Dave went on to Ball State and played quarterback there, and then following that, he and Ann got involved in ministry with Campus Crusade for Christ, working with athletes. They would go out and talk, they'd share the gospel with sports players. They were working at the University of Nebraska for a while and working with athletes there. And over the last 3 decades, Dave has been the chaplain for the Detroit Lions. In fact, he shared with me, he said, I am the losingest chaplain in NFL history, being 30 years as a chaplain for the Lions. But you see, his passion is to see guys who don't know Christ, who aren't walking with Christ, to see them hear the gospel, respond to the gospel, and to see their lives turned around. I think part of his passion for that is because of the home Dave grew up in. Dave grew up in a home where his dad was an alcoholic, angry, philandering airline pilot. In fact, Dave's dad divorced his mom when Dave was 7 years old. He told me that his dad used to take him on trips with him, and while he was still married to his mom, but he and his girlfriends would go on trips with Dave, the son. That's the dysfunction that was going on in this home. And when that's what you grow up with, most of what you grow up with in your house you just think is normal because that's what you're growing up with. But when Dave grew up and came to faith later, he went, that's not normal. And I think part of his desire to reach men who didn't know Christ and whose lives were amiss was because he grew up in a house with a dad who didn't know Christ and whose life was amiss. And when they started the church, that was his target. He wanted to reach those guys. And you know what? At their church, they see a lot of unchurched people coming and surrendering their lives to Jesus there. In fact, a lot more than we see, honestly, at Redeemer. And I thought about that, and I thought, I'm not sure that I have the same kind of burdened heart for people who are facing eternal death. Esther had it for her people who were facing physical death. She pleaded, how can I be comfortable when there are people facing death? Dave is burdened for lost people more than I am. And as I thought about that, I thought, honestly, if I'd been Mordecai, I might have been tempted in this moment to say, let's not press our luck with the king. We kind of pushed him a little hard today. We don't want to get him angry. We don't want to rock the boat here, so let's just back off. But the thought on Esther's heart was, as long as her fellow Jews, remember, a week ago she wasn't even admitting she was a Jew. Now, a week later, the burden that her fellow Jews might be facing death caused her to weep and fall at the king's feet and plead with him. And I read that and I thought, when was the last time I wept about anybody facing eternal death? When was the last time you and I were moved enough to do something, to care about that, to do anything? We're headed into a time of year when many of us are going to be with family members or friends, some of whom, if they died today, would be facing eternal death. And I thought we need to be thinking and praying now, asking God to give us opportunities to say something or to do something, to reach them, to bring hope to them. Esther, at this point, she's safe. She's richer than others. Her cousin is safe. He's in a position of power. But even with all of that happening with her, even the fact that she was secure and comfortable, she could not shake the fact that there were others who weren't safe. So I thought, can we just agree together during this season to ask God to give us a heart like Esther's for people who are facing death? Not physical death. I mean, those you'd have a heart for too, but those who are facing eternal death, spiritual death, who are separated from Christ. I don't know if you read this in the last 24 hours, but I read about Friday, the last day in President George Herbert Walker Bush's life. Read the account. His lifelong friend James Baker came to his house Friday morning, and the former president saw his friend come in, and he'd been in bed for most of the week. He was not eating. You could tell he was starting to fade. But the New York Times says when former Secretary of State Baker arrived at the Houston home on Friday morning to check on the president, Mr. Bush suddenly grew alert and his eyes were open, and he said, "Where are we going, Bake?" And Mr. Baker answered and said, "We're going to heaven." And Mr. Bush said, "That's where I want to go." By the way, my friend Dave Wilson, I asked him if his father ever repented. came to faith, made a profession of faith. And Dave said he did. He said the last 5 years of his life he was a different man. He said, I preached his funeral and forgave him, and it was a real turning point in my life. Look, there's hope. There is salvation for dying people. We lit the candle of hope this morning to remind us that there is hope in Christ. The story of your lost loved one or friend or relative, that story is not over as long as they have breath. And we need to be praying, and we need to be looking for opportunities to care. I don't know if that's a gift. I don't know if it's taking my Starbucks card at the Kroger. I don't know what it is that you do. I just know we should be on high alert during this season to say, Lord, would you give me a heart for people who are dying and facing eternal death? Well, you can tell when Esther comes to Xerxes and says, my heart is burdened for my people. You can tell he's a little miffed. She has pushed him a little bit, because you look back in verse 7, he says, look, I had Haman killed. I gave you everything that belonged to him. I put your cousin in charge of all of it. You want more? Right? There's just he doesn't say that exactly, but you can tell it's kind of like, haven't you gotten enough today? But in verse 8, he gives Esther and Mordecai an option. He says, if they can come up with something that doesn't seek to overturn the original edict, because the original edict cannot be overturned. You saw in here today, anything that's signed with the signet ring of the king cannot be overturned. That's called the law of the Medes and the Persians. That first edict that says on this day the Jews are to be put to death and their stuff is plundered, you can't renege on that. So he says, if you can come up with something that can help your people, you can issue a new edict and you can use your signet ring and you can send it out under my authority. And then the king exits. I just got to say, Xerxes is kind of like, I don't want to be bothered with this. Xerxes doesn't want to be bothered with being a king very much. He's been surrendering most of his stuff to other people. And here he says, okay, you can use your signet ring for a new edict, just leave me out of it. So Mordecai calls the scribes, he issues the new edict, and here's what it says. It says, on the day that the king gave permission for the Jews to be eradicated and their property to be plundered, the king now gives permission for the Jews to fight back and defend themselves. We can't do away with the first order, but here's what it means. Jews can now fight back under the king's order and protection. So here's what's happening. Before this new edict had been drafted and sent out, on this day in the future, when the Jews were marked for execution and to be plundered, the people in Persia, the Jews would have been out from under the protection of the satraps and the governors and the officials. So if an invading army or a group of people, marauders, are going to come in and kill the Jews, the officials, the policemen or the local armies, they're just going to back off because there's an edict. They're not going to stop the marauders from killing the Jews. In fact, some of these armies are thinking, let's join in because there's plunder to be had and we'll get to split that with the king. So that's the position that they were in. And if the Jews had fought back against their enemies on that day, the local officials would have not been on the Jews' side or sought to protect them at all. But with this new edict, now the local king's armies and forces are put on notice. Don't you attack them. Your job is to allow them to fight back. You've been moved from a potential participant in the eradication of the Jews to the referee slot. And you think about this original edict for a second. Who was going to be part of the original genocide? It wasn't going to be like your next door neighbors with some Jewish family, and you wake up one morning and go, hey, sorry about this, but today's that day you're supposed to be killed, so we're going to bring the kids over and kill you today. That's not how this would have worked. This would have been people who either hated the Jews or people who just liked mayhem and wanted your stuff. That's who was going to come after them. And again, it could have been some of those original armies. So now this new edict comes and says the Jews can defend themselves, and the local officials and the satraps have to enforce that edict, so they're out of the fight. The only people left now to kill and plunder the Jews are those who either hate them or the opportunists. And there are still a bunch of them, as we'll see in the next chapter. There is a fight that goes on this day that was appointed. There are still people who are operating under the old edict and saying, we've got the right to kill and plunder the Jews by the king's authority. But now, instead of having the law on their side, now they may face the opposing Jewish forces, and so they got to decide, do we really want to attack the Jews? This is what the new edict says. It says Jews can defend themselves against their enemies. And Mordecai has this certified with his ring, and he has it sent FedEx to all 127 provinces. I mean, this is ancient FedEx, but they're getting the king's horses from the stable, the best horses who had been bred by the royal stud, that are sending them out. And this is the author's way of saying this was going out as fast as possible. It's urgent news, and it's being distributed in all 127 provinces. By the way, the new edict uses the same language as the old edict. It says the Jews are free to defend their lives, to destroy, kill, and annihilate any armed forces that might attack them, children, women included, and to plunder the goods. Little spoiler alert, the battles come, we'll see that in the next chapter when we look at it, but the Jews don't plunder their enemies. And the author is quick to say that. The Jews, as they were fighting back, it wasn't about material gain for them. It was about defending themselves. So there are still battles, still people killed when the decree date rolls around. But think about it. In Jerusalem, for example, where most of the people living in Jerusalem are Jews, under the old edict, there might have been an army or a battalion or a group of people to say, let's take Jerusalem. They can't fight back. We've got the law on our side. But now they're going to back off. Now, let me say something here about the two edicts, Edict 1 and Edict 2. And to do this, I need to explain to you what's referred to as typology in the Old Testament. So in the Old Testament, there are things called types. Some of you have heard about this before. You know that there are stories or there are historical events that will happen in the Old Testament that are designed to give us a picture of the gospel and the coming Messiah. So when you read through your Old Testament, you ought to be thinking about, how does this prefigure, what does this remind me of related to Jesus? We've got prophecies in the Old Testament about the coming Messiah, but we also have a lot of historical events that are orchestrated by God to paint a picture of the coming of the Messiah. One pastor, a guy named Nick Batzig, says about these types, he says, there is perhaps nothing so faith-building in the Old Testament, apart from the explicit messianic prophecies, as God's covenantal structuring of history that gives us people, places, and events to prefigure the coming of the Messiah. God's covenantal restructuring or structuring of history. So let me give you some examples of Old Testament types. In the story of Joseph, we got a story about a guy whose brothers turn on him and who think they put him to death, but they find out he's alive, and he's not only alive, but he is there to save them in their time of need. Does that sound like anybody you've heard of before? Right? Put to death by his brothers. They thought he was dead. He's not really dead. He's there to offer salvation. Right? That's an Old Testament type. Here's another one, the story of Moses. People who are in bondage and in slavery, God sends a deliverer who he raises up, who frees them from the oppression and the slavery that they're under and leads them into a promised land. Again, sound like anybody you know of. These are Old Testament types. We see these over and over again in the Old Testament. Now, when you read the Old Testament, don't try to stretch everything into a type, right? Don't think to yourself, well, the whale is a picture of it, although the whale is. I mean, there's stuff with the whale, but we won't go into all of that. But just don't be a type hunter where you're looking for it all everywhere. But there'll be times when you'll read something and go, that reminds me of something about the gospel or about Jesus. That's there for a purpose. The Old Testament is there to point us and the Jews who were living it ahead. God was giving people living pictures of the Messiah, so when the Messiah came, they would go, oh, this is like David, this is like Moses, this is like Joseph. They would see how all of their heroes of their nation were pointing them toward Jesus. Now, you also have to remember when you're aware of types that all the parts in their stories don't necessarily line up. So you look at the story of Joseph, for example, and you see Joseph was tossed into the pit and they thought he was dead, but he wasn't really dead. And then he was sold into slavery. Okay, so you said, well, does that mean that Jesus, when he died on the cross, he wasn't really dead? And when did he get sold into slavery? Okay, so it's not like every point in somebody's life is a type, but there's type going on there. That's how they work. I say all of this because I think the two edicts that we're talking about here are a type of the two covenants that you find in the Bible. So there are two big covenants. There are lots of covenants in the Bible, but the two main covenants in the biblical story are the covenant of works and the covenant of grace. Those are the two big ones. In the garden, God gives to Adam the covenant of works. Here's what he says. You and I are going to get along fine. We're going to be in fellowship and in close relationship. You're going to be here in the garden. Everything's going to be good for you as long as you do one thing. Don't eat the fruit from that tree that's in the middle of the garden. That's the one thing that I'm calling on you. That's your work. Don't do that, and everything will be fine. And you know the story. You know what Adam and Eve do in chapter 3. They violate the covenant of works, and they bring death on themselves. So in terms of the covenant of works, here's how it worked. You give me perfect obedience, and the requirements are not onerous. You give me perfect obedience, and you get fellowship, and you get to live with me. That's union and fellowship that's unbroken. Here's what most people miss. The covenant of works is not replaced by the covenant of grace. So the covenant of grace does not undo the covenant of works. Do you know this? The covenant of works is still in effect today. For a person to experience union and fellowship with God, what is required is perfect obedience. There's not a plan B. The only way you can experience fellowship and unity with God is through perfect obedience. And some of you are going, well, wait, that's a problem. Well, it should be a problem. You don't have perfect obedience. Does that mean we're cut off? You say, but isn't there a plan B? Isn't the covenant of grace, isn't the gospel our plan B? Yes, but here's what most people miss. The covenant of grace fulfills or extends the covenant of works. Perfect obedience is still a requirement, and it was accomplished by Jesus, who lived a perfectly obedient life. He fulfilled the covenant of works, and now he extends the effectiveness of his perfect work so that others can experience the blessing. That's the grace part of it. Jesus comes as a man, as one of us, lives the life of perfect obedience that the covenant of works requires, and then he offers us a new covenant where we can have his perfect obedience extended. It becomes a part of our lives, and we have the right to be called children of God by believing on him and trusting in him. So the covenant of grace is this second edict coming from God that does not overturn the first edict, but it gives us a way to avoid the penalty of death and to experience life in Jesus. See, I think the two edicts in Esther are designed to foreshadow the covenant of works and the covenant of grace. Now, like I said, you shouldn't try to stretch this too far. Like the first edict, the king declares death and there's no way to escape. In the second edict, it doesn't overturn the first one, but there is a way of escape, and the way of escape is to fight back. And you know what? In the covenant, the new covenant, the covenant of grace, fighting back is involved in that too. Now let me be clear here. You don't earn a relationship with God by your works. You earn a relationship with God by believing in his Son, who offered perfect obedience. But to grow in our relationship with God, we have to fight back. We have to fight back against sin, our own flesh. We have to fight back against the culture that's pressing us in another direction. We have to fight back against the devil who wants to derail us. So our fighting back against the enemies of God is a part of the covenant of grace, the second edict that God's given us. The covenant of grace is not a passive covenant. We show that we are indeed God's children by loving what God loves and fighting back against the things that God hates. Again, these two edicts are not perfect pictures of these two covenants, but I think they remind us God has not rescinded the covenant of works with the covenant of grace. He's provided a new and living way for us to be united with Christ. That's what happens in Esther 8. This second edict is drafted, it's authorized, and it's distributed. And the last three verses tell us what the result of this new edict brings. Three things. Mordecai has some new robes and some pretty nice duds. I mean, he's got a crown, he's got purple, he walks out, he's looking good. Secondly, there is joy and rejoicing and feasting and holidays. And third, people in Persia start saying, I'm a Jew now. Okay? Certainly, Mordecai wearing these royal robes is another picture for us. It's another type of the result of the new covenant. You know, when you become a child of God, you get new robes too. Isaiah talks about them. He says, God gives us the garment of praise for the spirit, the faint spirit. In fact, in Isaiah 10, it says, 61:10, it says this, I will greatly rejoice in the Lord. My soul shall exult in my God, for he has clothed me with the garments of salvation, has covered me with the robes of righteousness. So when Mordecai walks out with his new robes given to him by the king that says, this is a different man than the guy who walked in here with sackcloth and ashes a week ago, it's a prefiguring of the kind of conversion that takes place when we come to God with our sackcloth and ashes, weeping and mourning over our sin, and God gives us royal robes and says, you're one of my kids now. You belong in the family. You're part of the kingdom. And as the psalmist declares, God has turned Mordecai's mourning into dancing. Now here's the question for you. Does the good news that God has issued a new covenant and made a way for you to be reconciled with him, does that bring joy and rejoicing to your heart? Does it drown out the circumstances of the trials and the difficulties you're facing in life today? If not, you need to reconsider the goodness of the good news. Remember where your life was headed before you knew Christ, and then think about where you're headed because he's saved you, and let that sink in, even in the midst of your circumstances. You know what the Bible says? It commands us to rejoice. Philippians 4:4, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say, rejoice. This is a verse that teaches us. It doesn't say deny your pain, deny your suffering, pretend like that's not real. Don't try to deny the fact that there's hardship in your life. It says don't let the sorrow and the sadness dominate your life. And when you experience it, renew your mind, think on things that remind you of what's true, and find your joy in the fact that you're a child of God, even in the midst of these difficult circumstances. That's what Paul did. He said, I faced tons of difficult circumstances, but I rejoiced because I belong to God. And these are light and momentary afflictions that are producing in me an eternal weight of glory. So if God is for you, who can be against you? That's what the Bible says. These people, when they hear the decree, they go, we have reason to rejoice. Even though there's still a battle day coming, we have reason to rejoice. The last verse in this chapter is that interesting one that says, people, the fear of the Lord has fallen on people. They say, I'm a Jew now. We don't know if these were folks who actually were converted to Judaism. Were they seeing that the God of the Jews was taking care of his people and thinking, I believe in that God? Or were they saying, look, if there's going to be a battle ahead, I want to be on the right side of this, and I think the Jews have got the upper hand? Or maybe they were thinking, okay, the Jews have got some friends in high places now, so today's a good day to be a Jew, right? We don't know exactly what's going on, but I would suggest there does seem to be some connection between the joy in people's hearts and the rejoicing of the people and the fact that people were saying, I want to be a Jew now. When your life is characterized by joy, by the fruit of the Spirit, by a joyful heart, by a joyful countenance, people will be attracted to the source of that in your life. I mean, when you see somebody who is full of love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and faithfulness and gentleness and self-control, you kind of go, that's a pretty good guy to hang around. That's a pretty good person to be pals with. I'd like to know where that comes from in you. And when that's true about us, that will attract people to our source of joy. This is why people watch idiotic Hallmark Christmas movies, right? Because people are acting like they have the fruit of the Spirit. Even ex-husbands are nice to their ex-wives in the Hallmark Christmas movies. Yeah, all right, we'll put all of that away. The message of Esther chapter 8 is that just because we've been saved doesn't mean that our job's over. That's what Esther is saying. Just because I'm saved doesn't mean My job's over. There are still people facing death, and I need to be working for their deliverance as well. And it's also that this second edict brought joy and deliverance in the same way that the new covenant should bring joy and deliverance to your heart, to all who have surrendered their lives to Jesus. So if that's you, rejoice. If it's not you, it can be you today. The good news of Christmas is that you can surrender your life and heart to Jesus and experience the transforming work of God in your life, who makes all things new, who gives you joy and love and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and gentleness, faithfulness, self-control. One more note from George Bush's last day. It turns out that Ronan Tynan, who is one of the Irish tenors, was in Houston on Friday, and he called the Bush house and said, could I come by? And they said, yeah. When he dropped by, the friends of the president and the family asked if he would sing a song for the president. And so he sang Silent Night. And the president was mouthing the words, sleep in heavenly peace. These elements on the communion table behind us remind us that the heavenly peace that God offers is offered to us because of the sacrifice of Jesus, because of the new covenant, which is offered us by his broken body and his shed blood. And so as we come each week to receive these elements, we come to say, my hope, my trust, my faith is in what Jesus has done for me. That's my source of life and of joy. If you're here this morning and that's true for you, you're welcome to join us in communion. We'll come down the outer aisles, receive the elements, go back through the center aisle to your seat, and we'll take them together. If you're here this morning and you would say, I don't know that that's true about me, that I don't know that I have this kind of a changed relationship in my life with Jesus. I'd love to talk to you about what it means to be completely surrendered to Christ and to live your life for him. Let's talk after the service is over. I'd love to visit with you about that. You prepare your hearts to come receive the elements. I'll prepare the table, and we'll take communion together here in just a minute.